Good morning. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Eurooppa Hall here in Helsinki. It's really nice to see so many of you attending here in person, and welcome also to everybody following us online. This event of climate risk management is of really high importance for societies as a whole and for the European Commission that I will be explaining in a moment. And we are happy as the Commission representation in Finland to co-host this event together with the Provide research program. My name is Ismo Ulvila. I'm a Commission spokesperson in Finland and head of media, and I will be chairing or presenting the beginning of this event until the panel when Kaisa will take the media. As I'm sure you all know, Europe is currently the fastest growing in the world, so we do have a special interest in what is happening out there. We also have pretty fresh data from 2 weeks ago. We had the climate stocktake report that is telling us, based on science, that the globe is on average heading towards 2.7 degree warming by the end of this century with current measures. So it remains to be seen how the NDC cycle under the UNFCCC next year will be raising the ambition, as is indicated it should in the Paris Agreement. So today we will be learning more of those risks, how they might be unfolding in the future, and what needs to be done to really step up the action against climate change and improving the climate resilience. We do have in the next presentation and in the panel some excellent speakers, top experts, and just a word on the housekeeping. May I have the next slide? You may bring your questions through a tool that is called Flinga. You can scan the QR code with your mobile phone or access the tool through the link that Jussi is providing us right there. And once you are there, click the button Send to write your question or comment, and you can try it right away. Just to say hello, nice to be here. So let's get started. There's a small change in the program. Since after Kaisa invited to provide some opening words, I made her an offer she could not refuse. So instead of 5 minutes, you will have to bear with me for 10 minutes. And then after I've done, we go straight to Leena. So I prepared a small and short presentation to you. There are 3 slides. They will be shared to you after this event. Just to say that I'm a little bit out of my comfort area. I come from the climate negotiation side, not that much from the environment side, but nevertheless a few observations of what the Commission is doing at the moment, the current Commission, and what is foreseen for the next mandate, 24 to 29. So what do we know is that last year was the hottest recorded, and it was the first time we've reached the 1.5 degree Paris threshold, and I think the question that is at everybody's mind is on whether this is going to be the permanent norm in the near future. Just very rapidly, can I have the next slide, please, Jussi? So what we have done already at the EU level is that we do have, a few years back, we do have the EU strategy on adaptation to make adaptation smarter, swifter, and more systemic, and to step up international action and all these things. This is also something that comes from the UN Climate Framework Convention negotiations. We have the adaptation goal. We also have language in the EU climate law, where there are provisions for adaptation. We have provisions for adaptation also in something that is called the NESEPs, the National Energy and Climate Programs, which are mandatory for all member states to provide, which the Commission is analyzing, and the adaptation goals should be integrated there. Now we know that the next Commission will be enhancing the so-called governance regulation under the climate regulation or the climate sector, which means that the NESEPs in the future will probably be more forceful and have more ambition and more mandatory action to the member states. But clearly, this is something that we have been doing so far, but the question is on whether it is enough. That's why we, as DG Climate, the Commission, we have started together with DG FISMA, which is on the financial market side. There is the climate resilience dialogue ongoing, and I think this is really important, and this is one of the, I would say, action streams that comes from the Paris Agreement. You may remember that in the Paris Agreement we have the famous Article 2.1c that states that all the climate flows, all the financing flows should be made climate resilient. So the Commission is taking this action really seriously. And it's not only on the mitigation side, but it is also touching the adaptation side. It's also important if we put some local context to what is happening out there. We have the research arm of the European Commission, which is called the Joint Research Centre, the JRC. For example, for Finland, they have estimated that the climate change damage to the building block could be worth some 13 billion euro by the end of this century. We have another European institution, the European Court of Auditors, that just last week, in fact, made public their special report that took stock of what is the state of the climate adaptation in the EU. And they concluded that while the direction of travel broadly is going to the right direction, there are issues of data management, there are issues of setting the priorities right, or sometimes there is even wrong kind of adaptation, such as, for example, increasing irrigation when you should basically use different kinds of crops and these kind of things. And reporting should be adapted, and there are these tools such as Climate Adapt and Copernicus that are not widely used. I think this builds, there is a link from these findings also to the resilience to this research program, because it shows that even in Europe, even in the EU overall, we still haven't touched all the layers of the different actors on what needs to be done in the decades to come. A couple of numbers on the economic losses. Those are estimated due to extreme climate events at the EU. Those are estimated at 26 billion euro per year. And just 2 days ago, for example, what the Commission is concretely doing is that we reprogrammed for 7 member states, that's the last text there, EU budget funding for over 20 billion. These are the floodings in Central Europe, the forest fires in Portugal. So we did reprogram funding for those member states to go forward. And there are some numbers on what is the level of the EU budget funding on this. So things are happening. Next slide. But is it enough? And that's why what I argue is that we need to move beyond adaptation. This is already happening during this mandate. And there we come to some interesting findings on what is the link between the climate and biodiversity and nature legislation and how the Commission sees these things. In February, in the Commission communication on the 2040 EU climate target, we did include some language on the resilience aspects. We also made quite a comprehensive communication in March on managing climate risk. I'm not going to say more about that because I'm sure that Leena will be giving you in the next presentation much more specific explanation on what is the EU CRA. But moving forward, we also had a look at the productive side. In August, a special report on the future of EU agriculture was published. This is one of the 4 reports that will be feeding, high-level strategic reports that will be feeding to the next Commission mandate. And that tells us on how the common agricultural policy should be made more sustainable, and what are those transformative practices and how to improve resilience together with the agriculture production. Then, of course, we have the famous Restoration Act that does introduce European legislation on how to reverse biodiverse degradation and recover biodiverse ecosystems. So this is really much in line with the UNCPD targets. In fact, the UNCPD COP, as you know, is currently ongoing in Cali. And that also targets very much the issue of the resilience. The EU Council conclusions, the negotiation mandate for Cali UNCPD COP, underlines the importance of the natural-based solutions, and so that everybody, notably the indigenous people, should benefit. Next slide, please. So, on the next mandate, and this is my last substance slide, there is really a lot of language on how the incoming Commission sees this topic. If you look at the political priorities as set by the incoming Commission President Ursula von der Leyen in her Europe's Choice policy book or policy document, the language such as rewarding farmers, working with nature, preserving biodiversity and natural ecosystems, those are on pages 21 to 22 of that. There is language of protection of our natural world. There is very explicit language on stepping up work on climate resilience and so on and so forth. Of course, next week we're going to have President Niinistö's report for the Commission and EU on comprehensive preparedness and so on. And then my final point, how to make this operational. We're going to have the Commissioner hearings at the beginning of November. If you look at the terms of references, the mission letters for the nominated commissioners, there are strong links to on how to make operational the political guidelines. For the Environment Commissioner Jessica Roswell of Sweden, there is a task of improving EU's natural capital, start providing natural credits, private investment, very important, and so on. For the crisis management, there is language for the tourism industry, for the Greek Commissioner, for the Energy Commissioner, Mr. Hansen. There is the Sustainability and Resilience, sorry, this is not the Energy Commissioner, but the Agriculture Commissioner. There is the Sustainability and Resilience of Agriculture sector, and so on and so forth. So these are topics that are really on the agenda of the incoming Commission. And I think that once we get to the hearings in 2 weeks' time, and when we have next year's work program, these might be becoming much more explicit. And obviously next year we're going to have the Commission proposal for the next EU budget, the so-called MFF, where we're going to see how those policies are then going to be taken forward in the years to come. So, moving forward, sorry I took 12 minutes of your time, I went over time. What we can say is that while the Commission is certainly ready to play its role, we of course have the other EU institutions and agencies that are also contributing to this challenge and to these tasks. And what really motivates us is in this regard is the first European climate risk assessment that was published this spring, and that is a perfect opportunity now for me then to welcome and introduce to you the Executive Director of the European Environmental Agency, Ms. Leena Ylämononen, who will talk to you about the findings on this report. So Jussi, could you please take Leena? Leena, can you hear us? We can't hear you.
Good.
Now
I will
we can.
share my
Yes, floor is yours.
slide. Thank you. I still hear a bit of echo from the meeting room, so I don't know whether something can be done with that. Huomenta and good morning from Copenhagen, where our agency indeed is situated and has been working for already 30 years. I don't know whether something can be done with that. I'm very happy to be in this event and tell you about our climate risk assessment that was published last spring. As Ismo already explains very well, last year was the hottest year in records. This year, many experts believe, is going to be one following 2023. So also a record hot year. And it's becoming more and more usual that we are breaking all these temperature and other records. And with that, serious weather impacts. But of course, also, as Isma, you explained, it is not only about climate. So the environmental crisis that we are facing, they are actually very systemic. Climate change, biodiversity loss, pollution, the so-called triple planetary crisis, they're all interlinked and can only be tackled also effectively, simultaneously, by a so-called systemic approach that seeks really to configure our energy, food, mobility, and industrial systems to make them suitable for this new paradigm. As you well know, the EU is committed to achieving climate neutrality by 2050 at the latest, along with the intermediate target to reduce greenhouse gases by at least 55% by 2030 compared to 1990 levels. And these targets, one can say, are ambitious, but they are also absolutely necessary to hold on the pathway to limit the impact of global warming. And of course, the other continents and countries should follow suit, what the EU is doing. We are currently analyzing the 2023 greenhouse gas emissions data for publication later, most likely early next year. But this graph shows that in 2022, net greenhouse gas emissions were 31% below 1990 levels. And this, yes, one can say it means significant progress, but it also underscores that 70% of the required effort needs to be realized within the next 28 years. So approximately one generation. And to meet the 2030 target, there is an imperative need to more than double the annual reduction effort seen since 2005. So we need to scale up and speed up the mitigation efforts dramatically. But regardless of the progress we make in mitigation of climate change, we need to prepare and adapt our societies for the basically inevitable effects that we already see and which will intensify in the coming years. So, in light of this need to adapt and to build societies that are more resilient to the impacts of climate change, our agency published with the collaboration with many other actors, the European Climate Risk Assessment, or EUCRA as we call it, this year in spring. It is a first of its kind, a comprehensive assessment of current and future climate risks. So the main objective of the Commission indeed is taking them up in its work program for the next term and develop EU policies in climate-sensitive sectors in particular, and to support a prioritization of adaptation-related investments, which are huge. And of course, it also in light of the multi-annual financial framework, which is soon to be proposed. And to provide, of course, also a reference to the subsequent national and regional climate risk assessment. EUCRA assessment examines key risk across the sectors that you can see on this slide: terrestrial, marine and coastal ecosystems, water, food and energy security, human health, the built environment, and risk to the EU's outermost regions. And it also looks at specific scenarios, so-called storylines, which could trigger actually new or aggravate pre-existing crises and emergencies, including extreme heat and prolonged drought, large-scale flooding, which we have again seen this year and this autumn as well in Europe, pests and infectious diseases, forest disturbances and loss of carbon sinks, critical infrastructure failures, or disruption of international supply chains, and stability of financial markets and public finances. So quite a broad areas. The EUCRA identifies a total of 36 major climate risks for Europe, with the potential for severe consequences. They are grouped in 5 clusters that you can see here. So ecosystems, food, health, infrastructure, and economy and finance. 21 out of the 36 risks identified in the assessment need more action now, with 8 of them being particularly urgent. And this means that we not only need to continue of existing policies, but we also need to increase the ambition, scope, and implementation. I give very top line a few examples on each from each score, cluster, starting with ecosystems. Climate risks to ecosystems are especially relevant because they can often cascade to other societal systems. Take marine and coastal ecosystems. They are threatened by the combined effects of climate-related drivers and other anthropogenic, so human-made drivers, creating critical risks for the ecosystems themselves, but also to the communities living in coastal areas. When it comes to food, Europe already faces multiple challenges to food production and security, including necessity to reduce agriculture's own environmental footprint. And crop production is already facing substantial climate risks in Europe as a whole. And of course, critical risk levels are already a fact in Southern Europe. Food production can be hit by meteorological events, such as late frost or heavy rain, as well as current and emerging pests and diseases. Regarding health, climate change poses major risk to health systems as a whole, with heat-related risks already at critical levels in Southern Europe, but also elsewhere. In the summer of 2022, between 60,000 and 70,000 premature deaths in Europe were attributed to heat. And these numbers could increase substantially in the coming decades, unless we take effective actions and also implement them to protect especially vulnerable people. On infrastructure and the built environment, extreme weather events and slow onset climate change are posing increasing risks. These can disrupt essential services, including energy supply, water supply, and transport networks. And the risks are worsened by Europe's aging building stock and infrastructure, as well as by growing demands for the services they provide. So urgent action is needed to ensure that the infrastructure is climate resilient in the future. And projections estimate that if we don't increase adaptation actions, damages from coastal flooding could reach up to 1 trillion euros annually by 2100. So end of the century. And finally, economy and finance. Climate change is now recognized as a major macroeconomic, macrofiscal, and financial risk. Economic losses from weather and climate-related extreme events in the EU member states from 1980 to 2022 exceeded 650 billion euros, and less than 1/5 of these losses were insured. So current assessments project that European macro-fiscal and financial systems are at substantial risk from the impacts of climate change, both within Europe and of course also globally. So we will need to build resilience within a context which has recently been referred to as a polycrisis. So it's much more complex than only having a warming climate. So this describes convergence of economic, social, geopolitical, and environmental crises, which together create systemic risks to the world as we know it. And social fairness and the way that the economic impacts of sustainability transitions are felt differently across social groups, economic sectors, and geographical regions will become more important in political discussion also when moving forward. So we will need to work towards a comprehensive and holistic policy framework where climate, economic, industrial and labour market and social policies build a coherent system which can support sustainability. We hope that the EUCRA report has had, and I believe it already has had, a significant impact amongst the policymakers and other stakeholders. It is mentioned specifically in the mission letter to the Commissioner designate for climate, net zero and clean growth, so Wopke Hoekstra, Well, the mission letters for 5 other commissioner designates request their contributions to the climate adaptation plan. So this is indeed a good news. Several EU member states have mentioned the intention to replicate all or part of the UCRA methodology in their national risk assessments. For example, Slovenia, Belgium, Spain, Ireland, to align the schedule of national risk assessment with future UCRAs, Lithuania, and to use UCRA to advance their national policy agenda on adaptation. For example, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands, France, and Slovakia. The future is, of course, far from certain, but we have more knowledge than ever before. And our challenge is to showcase how addressing sustainability, climate, and environmental challenges in a smart way can simultaneously address also parallel concerns, contributing to the EU's competitiveness and strategic autonomy, while also helping to build a fairer, healthier society and a stronger democracy across all our geographies and regions, and indeed across the entire globe. So this was my presentation. Thank you very much, and I hope to have a very fruitful discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Leena, for giving us, I would say, a very blunt message, and also what science tells us for policy making. And indeed, as you mentioned, and what is also the essence of the Commission communication from March that I mentioned on managing climate risks, we need to step up the work, and we need to have all the actors contributing at all the levels, at municipal, regional, national level, including civic society, private sector. I think that's the direction of the travel. This brings us to our next 2 presentations. We're going to have first Professor Dr. Karl Friedrich Schloessner, I hope I pronounce it right, who is the consortium lead of the Horizon 2020 financed project PROVIDE, and he will be followed by Dr. Helena González Lindberg, who is going to present a case study from Bodø, Norway. Professor Dr. Schloessner, you have the floor, please.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ismo, Lena. I hope you can see me okay. It looks like my window now is a bit small on your screen. Is that correct? Or in which case, let me share my screen again. We tried this, of course, before, and now it doesn't work. As always, I try again. Let's see if that is any better. Yes, that looks better to me, at least from here. Thank you. Yeah, thank you again, Ismo, Lena, for kicking us off. Very, very interesting and great synergies there. I'm Karl Schloessner, and yes, you did a great job in pronouncing my name, which is really also in German a bit of a challenge. I come to present to you a bit of a framework discussing questions of climate overshoot, in particular the question of what risks of climate change are avoidable and unavoidable, and how we navigate also these interdependencies between the mitigation ambition and the needs that we have, and the resulting adaptation action that we need to do in definitely tackling the unavoidable risks of climate change as they are already posed to us, as also Lena has been highlighting in her presentation before. So a few quick words about the project, and why I do this is also in particular to try to lure you to check out our website for the Climate Risk Dashboard, which is the climate services platform that provides you with some of these insights. Indeed, there is a lot of such platforms out there, and in particular also being provided from the Commission that are providing very valuable information. But we are trying to supplement this a little bit with some specific aspects that you may find useful, in particular in relation to sectoral climate impact risks and risks, as well as urban climate data. The project itself focuses on the question of risks of climate overshoot. So if we were to exceed the 1.5 degree limit of the Paris Agreement, what would be the consequences of this? And also, and that is, I think, is something that is going to go as a red thread through my presentation, not just thinking about overshooting global limits, such as the 1.5 limit, but also what are the consequences of overshooting local limits, for example, system thresholds that we may or may not understand very well, limits to certain adaptation actions and other factors. So how do we incorporate the existence of such thresholds also into climate risk assessments and into adaptation planning. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that. First, to say how we are doing this. So it's a very interconnected approach to assessing climate risks, from exploring a wide range of different climate scenarios to then regional and sectoral impacts, and even going all the way down to the urban scale. So we start out with exploring really a wide range of scenarios, including some of the most recent policy relevant scenarios like the current policy scenario, NDC scenarios, but obviously also a wide range of different 1.5 degree scenarios, focusing also on peak and decline scenarios to understand what the consequences are of a potential climate overshoot and what impacts are reversible or irreversible in such a scenario. We then move on to look into this in terms of sectoral climate impact projections, including cryosphere impacts for glaciers, biodiversity loss, and other factors. And this allows us, and I'm going to talk about this a little bit, to really identify avoidable and unavoidable as well as irreversible future climate impacts. Because we explore such a wide range of scenarios, we can actually make robust statements about what climate risks may be avoidable and unavoidable in the future. And we don't stop there. We push this all the way to the urban scale. So we have high-resolution climate projections for 140 cities worldwide. And we have done some case studies where we also then developed urban adaptation storylines under overshoot scenarios. And my colleague Helena has been leading one of those in the city of Bodø in Norway. And she's going to talk to you about that in just a few minutes. So having said that, I want to move a little bit to the topic of overshoot. And there's a very simple message that comes out of our project that won't surprise any one of you, but I think it's something that we need to tackle with very serious consideration. And that's the simple insight that overshooting is a risky business. Like, we are playing very much fast and loose with some potentially irreversible impacts on the climate system. And we need to understand that, and we need to understand the consequences and also the required actions on our side that we need to take to manage risks in the near and in the short term under a potential climate overshoot scenario. So my previous speakers have both spoken to where we stand in terms of the current climate. That's obviously something that we've been looking into in great detail. And the question on where we stand in regarding also to the 1.5 limit. We have seen record temperatures emerging in 2023 and now all over 2024. And there is a very substantial chance that 2024 might even come in as the first individual year above 1.5 degrees. There's important to highlight that this doesn't mean that we have reached or even exceeded the Paris Agreement temperature limit, because it refers to the long-term human-induced warming, which currently stands at around 1.3 degrees, as we've shown in a recent publication just this year. And it is also emerging consensus in the scientific community that they understand what is currently happening in terms of natural variability, and that this is indeed a year that is linked to a very strong emerging signal from the El Nino oscillation. So we are switching from a La Nina year to a El Nino year, and this is driving a record sea surface temperatures around the globe and the respective impacts of this. Yet it is a very, very stark warming that we are inching ever closer to 1.5, and this is a sneak peek into ongoing research also from our project, trying to understand what a single year above 1.5 would mean in terms of an early warning when we might reach that level. And indeed, it could happen up to a decade before we are at or around 1.5 in the long-term average. It doesn't mean we are there yet, but if you had 3 years above 1.5, there would be a very likely chance that we probably are also in the long-term average at that level. So it is a stark warning that we are inching closer, and that's the question also on how we navigate the impacts and risks emerging at a 1.5 degree warming and or potentially even above need to be taken very seriously. In that context, we looked into the question of what would be the consequences of exceeding 1.5, and we've done so in a recent publication that came out in the journal Nature just a couple of weeks ago, where we look into this in a wide range of different facets, also looking into the potential consequences of high-risk warming outcomes, because when we talk about overshoot and reflect on overshoot, we very often, and narrowly so, think about median climate outcomes or best estimates. But what we need to actually take into account also for climate risk assessments and local planning is also high-end warming risks. And how do we do this systematically, and what are the consequences of those? And we are doing so in this project and in this publication, and it shows that really there's basically a very significant risk of such high warming outcomes under overshoot. It's going to be maybe a lot more challenging than we currently think to reverse warming. And what we can say with confidence is also that overshoot is not another way to achieve the same climate outcomes. So regional climates after an overshoot going to be to a large extent different, and in different sectors we will have potentially long-term irreversible damages that arise from any such an overshoot. Doing so, I give you one example. This is the risk of local species extinction for Finland. For two different scenarios. The blue one is a 2020 climate policy scenario leading to up on 2.7 degrees by 2100. The green one is a 1.5 degree scenario that peaks global temperatures around mid-century. And what you do, and there's the map inlays give you a bit of an idea of the risks of this, and you see very, very significant risks of local species extinction. This is the climatological habitability for these species as identified in the model with tens of thousands of different species globally. It doesn't mean these species can't migrate. It also doesn't mean that these species are going extinct globally, but it actually shows the scale in which climatic changes are pressuring ecosystems and may destabilize also the food web that we are looking into and the complex interconnections in between. But if we wanted to look into this, you also see that the uncertainties around different scenarios remain very substantial. So we also probably want to consider some of the high risk outcomes, and in the high warming scenario that could be up to close to 80%. But we may also wonder, well, if you now wanted to be informed about how to avoid a certain risk, for example, losing or having about a third of local species at the risk of extinction, I may want to, for example, draw a line here and ask myself, what's a threshold I want to avoid? Do I want to kind of be informed of what if I can still have a good chance to not see more than 30% of species in Finland being at risk of local extinction? And if you wanted to do this, often the way we provide climate risk information is not ideal. So we have the scenario approach where uncertainties increase basically as we go down the impact chain to the local and sectoral impact level. And this is not the best way to necessarily inform any such questions. And we have developed in the project something that we call the reversal of the impact chain, where you as an end user can set your risk threshold. It might be a threshold that you are looking at from a planner's or sectoral expert's perspective, and then can reflect on whether or not these risks are avoidable or what the probabilities are of exceeding them. And if you now take this, there's the title is wrong. Sorry, it's 30% of local species extinction in Finland. Apologies. If you take this threshold level, then you do see in the dark gray bars, there's a substantial risk of this happening. That we are, even in the best possible scenario that we can assess currently in the literature, there's still a considerable risk that 30% of species in Finland will be at risk of local extinction. But you also see what is still be avoidable by mitigation. So the light gray bars show you how the risks are actually increasing over time if we follow the current policy pathway to almost certainty by the end of the century that this is going to happen. And you do see that this risk is something that you can substantially avoid and reduce, in particular also towards the end of the century. So there's a lot to gain by stringent mitigation, as Lena has also highlighted just before me. Yet we need to adapt to the bottom part, and we need to consider these risks also very thoroughly in local planning. Speaking of local planning, I want to give you an example of what you can also find as outputs from the project. This is heatwave days per year in the city of Helsinki in 2050. Provided in very high resolution, so at 100 meters, and you can look at also the questions of what urban hotspots, for example, or what urban hotspots would emerge and how they would the climate risk at these locations would specifically change over time. And you can ask yourself, what does it mean for transgression of, for example, certain adaptation limits and different actions, and how do we incorporate again high risk outcomes in adaptation planning? And I want to illustrate this, and at the end of my presentation, in a way, looking at basically it's a stylized map, not based on Helsinki, based on the city of Islamabad, for different adaptation responses in urban environments. So the first two present some incremental measures, so planting of new tree species or improved water management. The third one presents a transformational adaptation action, so the design of urban ventilation corridors. They have different planning or growing times, and then they have a lifetime of the measure. In particular, ecosystem-based adaptation actions need to consider the fact that these ecosystems themselves are going to be impacted by climate change. So also urban tree species do not survive any kind of heat or drought events. We need to kind of consider seriously what they are actually, the climate suitability of any of those species are, and how this is going to emerge in the future. So we have a lifetime of the measure. We have like some uncertainty around this. So we have a risk of measure ineffectiveness over time. But if you looked at this graph now for the median climate projections, even in the current policy scenario over the 21st century, it looks like you can kind of play around with these actions. You can phase them in and out. You can actually incorporate them into a dynamic adaptation planning schedule with basically giving you a few decades of lead time. But if you are now a bit more risk averse and you ask yourself, okay, I really want to have certainty that this actually works, and so I want to look at the high-end climate risk outcome for the same scenario, then this picture changes, unfortunately, rather drastically. Because in an urban environment, and you looked into the 5% probability outcome on the very high end, so the 95th quantile in terms of warming, then you see that for your incremental measures, the lifetime can potentially be very short. So there is a risk of very extreme heat drought events, for example, emerging a lot faster than you would actually estimate in your median case, which could undermine new trees actually growing. So therefore, your adaptation action becomes ineffective. You run the risk of maladaptation. And you are not actually incorporating high-end climate risks or the potential stresses on your adaptation actions in such a way that you're actually climate resilient in the way of being resilient to the most impactful outcomes of climate change that you need to consider. So our framework does allow you to assess some of these risks in a systematic manner. So you can actually define your levels of risk aversion. You can play around with climate risks and the exceedance risks for local thresholds. And we hope that this can be useful to inform adaptation action also on the ground. And with this, I'll hand over to my colleague Helena to present to you some of our work that we've done in local case studies. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Carl.
Thank you, Carl. Thank you, Carl, for giving us such a...
Hello, my name is Helena Gonzalez-Lundberg, and I'm speaking to you from... Sorry? Is it all okay?
Yeah, it's okay. Just go ahead, please.
Okay, thank you. So, next slide, please, Carl. So Bodø is a medium-sized city in northern Norway. Maybe some of you know. It's located on Lule and Pitesami land and surrounded by coast and mountains and forests. In our case study of Bodø in the Provide project, we have mainly focused on the build-up center. So it's not the biggest city, but in a Norwegian scale, quite a decent-sized city. And in Bodø, we are expecting increase of precipitation, where more will fall as rain in seasons where snow has been the case. And there's also the risks of more storm surges and coastal flooding. But in this presentation, I'm going to focus mostly on the avoidable risks within the urban structure. And we have found, together with a lot of discussions with local stakeholders, mainly the municipality, that there's quite a high adaptive capacity in Bodø and a lot of efforts underway. But there's a concern about the overall awareness of the future risks of climate change. Next slide, please. So in Provide, our colleagues, the modelers, have used flood forecast modeling to look at what areas within the urban structures of Bodø are more prone for flooding. And this red square you can see in the middle is part of the focus here. It's around Bodø River, which is quite an important stream. As you see, it drains from the mountain and down to the sea, while a lot of other small streams have been paved and don't have this natural drainage capacity anymore. So it's especially in the junctions between the river and more infrastructure like roads and industrial areas that are important. The flood depth is not very extreme, so we're talking 1/2 to 1 meter depth. But of course, this can make great inconveniences for the local inhabitants and for the infrastructure. Yeah, so thank you. Bye. Here you see some pictures of from Bodø with a focus on the current urban build-up environment. I think it's quite a typical example of a city in the northern Norway, where you have some parks, you have public green spaces, some green avenues along roads, but also a high degree of private green spaces, because a lot of people here have single private family houses within the urban structure. And you also have quite a lot of sealed surfaces of parking lots in between the bottom right photo there is from the harbor area here. And also in between, you see the hotels there. It's a lot of paved areas without any vegetation. And when it comes to, of course, the potential future flooding, the vegetation is very important in order to be able to both avoid not having the runoff of surface water, but also to contribute to reduce the heat stress within the urban fabric. So adaptive measures that we have kind of suggested for Bodø is to work on de-sealing and greening the industrial zones and the parking lots, as well as making these kind of green connections between green spaces. As you can see here, we have modeled or mapped out the existing green spaces. You see the private green, the household gardens are quite extensive throughout the urban fabric, while the public and semi-public parks and green fields are a bit scattered around and not connected. So the strategic vision that the project has seen for Bodø is to make the green parks connected along the main routes and the streets, with, again, a focus on this Bodø River to the right. You see quite big, large green area there. If you just press now, Carl, I can see the satellite image of this region. So as you can see, this area is both quite heavily paved. In the middle, we have this shopping district, but then you also have these green fields to the right, top right, where there is still some agricultural activity, both professional, but also this urban farming. And it's important. It's a very important recreational area for the citizens. Of course, we have lots of wild nature here in Bodø, but especially for the elderly and for children, it's important to have closeness to nature around where they live. And to reduce the flooding along the stream, it's important to set up zones of water buffering. And what we have seen is that Bodø municipality is on a good path. The two top pictures, you see that they have built a buffer zone underneath the large roads that leads into the city. And this has also been made into more of a recreational area, but also a place where the floodwater can kind of it can be in extreme levels of flow water here without destroying any infrastructure. So what we have found is that Bodø is doing a lot of positive things, but there's still a lot of areas for improvement. And as I mentioned earlier, the private gardens could play a quite important role as they take up a lot of the space in the urban fabric. And what we are working on now is to encourage the private house owners to make their gardens more biodiverse, to pay more attention to the ecological management of their gardens, including, having local species and these kind of things, but also the importance that these gardens have in infiltrating the potential high levels of rainwater that we're expecting. And of course, it's important to note that although the municipality is working quite good at this at the moment, this kind of work requires committed investments and, of course, political will to continue to be implemented and further developed within the city. And just wanted to point out that our local stakeholders have been very appreciative of this very detailed analysis of what they're doing, really down to the nitty-gritty level of single trees and single shrubs and fields. And it's important to look at design measures to adapt to avoidable risks in a very local context, and especially with the people who are working with it. Yeah, short and brief. Thank you.
Thank you, Carl and Helena, for painting us the big picture and the very pragmatic picture. Now, we are a little bit behind our schedule, but I think it was really important to listen everything because there's so much to say. Without further ado, I'm handing over to Kaisa. I'm sure we're going to tackle some of these issues in the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Ismo. Thank you, Ismo. Do I need to please welcome the panelists here? Is my microphone working? No. Okay, now it's working. Great. No, you can take whatever order you want, please. For what we feel I will then introduce you later. So, thank you very much, Carl and Helena, and Leena, and Ismo for the presentations so far. Now it's indeed time for me to take over here in Helsinki. My name is Kaisa Kosonen. I'm a senior policy advisor for Greenpeace and a member of the Provide Project's stakeholder advisory board. So I will facilitate the rest of the event as we move into the panel discussion. And we have an excellent panel here today, with the names of whom you can see there on the screen, but I will also present them while we go further. I have also received some questions already, or we have seen in Flinga, and Jussi, if you show the Flinga link again, people can see that if you have questions for this panel, you can again use that email address or that QR code and place your question there. So, it is indeed great to hear that the Commission is ready to step up with several commissioners having climate risk management in their portfolios. That is already a really good thing. But building resilience is a collaborative effort. Most of the climate risks are co-owned by the EU and its member states, and cities play a key role in building resilience, as does the private sector and financial institutions. So now let's hear from the practitioners. And by the way, Ismo said earlier that he's a bit in a sort of not on his comfort zone with all of this. And if you feel like you were not on your own comfort zone with all the presentations you've seen so far, don't worry, you will get all the presentations afterwards. And there's a link to that climate risk dashboard with which you can play more and get a better understanding of what's in there. But now I would like to bring in Elina Väänänen, who is a climate change specialist at the European Investment Bank, who will be joining us online. Thank you, Jussi. So, EIB is the lending arm of the European Union and the world's largest multilateral lender. You are the biggest provider of climate finance and invest in projects that strengthen climate resilience. We've just heard from Leena that despite growing action, overall Europe is not prepared for what's ahead. How does that resonate to you, and what does stepping up climate resilience mean for the EIB?
Thank you very much, and a real pleasure to be joining you, unfortunately, remotely. And thank you for all the presentations so far. I think we've already had a very, very rich discussion. The theme of stepping up is actually very, very topical for us at the EIB. We're very hard at work at implementing our first dedicated climate adaptation plan, which sets out how we will step up and how and adaptation across the EU, but also outside the EU. And maybe just to take a little bit of background on how we got to this realization that we needed to do more. Even prior to the adaptation plan, which we came out with back at the end of 2021, we had over a decade of experience in investing in climate resilience and adaptation across sectors, across geographies. Of course, most of our finance and most of our investment is in the EU, but also outside. So we've done things like underground and transmission lines, for instance, in Finland, to support them, to protect them from extreme weather events. We supported climate resilient water supply across Europe and Africa, did a lot in post-disaster reconstruction. So we had a wealth of experience in concrete projects on the ground, but also in mainstreaming climate resilience considerations into our business process by screening actually all of our direct lending for physical climate risks. And so we had this experience, but we were also seeing that projects were not coming to us at the scale that we needed. We saw that many of our clients across the public and private sectors were still struggling actually making sense of what physical climate risks are, what are the relevant risks to them, and how to plan and how to devise investments to address these physical climate risks. So as the EU Climate Bank, of course, traditionally very, very focused on the mitigation challenge, as we should be, we realized we needed to do more in support of physical climate risk management, in support of climate resilience and adaptation, and came out with this EIB adaptation plan back in 2021, at the end of 2021. We set out objectives to support faster, smarter, and more systemic adaptation, very much aligned with the EU adaptation strategy that we already heard about earlier in the event, and set out to do this not only in the EU, but have a more dedicated focus also in the outside EU context through our EIB Global, our kind of outside EU investment arm. So just to give you a very quick idea of what this means for us in practice, smarter, faster, more systemic. Faster adaptation is about stepping up the volume and impact of EIB adaptation finance. I'll perhaps focus just on the volume part, because as you can imagine, as a bank, we're very driven by numbers, by targets. They get us moving. And so we came up with a lending target of ensuring that 15% of all our climate finance is dedicated to climate change adaptation. I know this might actually not sound so ambitious, but for us, it represented truly a step change, almost tripling our climate adaptation finance in this 5-year period that we're in right now. It's also been a very, very ambitious target, not least because of the uptick in mitigation finance that we've seen. Repower EU, all sorts of commitments around the mitigation side have made actually this target even harder to reach than we perhaps anticipated. But we've made significant progress, and we really hope we will make this target next year. Still about to see whether we do it or not. But the intention has certainly made a big difference for us in just moving us and forcing us to look at adaptation and climate resilience in a more concerted way across the institution. Then moving to the smarter and more systemic adaptation, I think it aligns very well with the presentations we've heard today. We saw that there was very much a need to bridge the climate knowledge gap, both internally but also externally, and provide targeted advisory support, advisory services, technical assistance on adaptation and resilience to our clients. We're very proud to be working with the Copernicus Climate Change Service, enhancing our own and hopefully eventually also our clients' access to best available climate data. We've made available a dedicated one-stop shop called the ADAPT platform for advisory services in the EU, where our clients can access actually for free of charge advisory services dedicated to adaptation and resilience. And as a more recent development, just to highlight that we just last week signed a MOU, a partnership with the EEA, with the presence of Executive Director Ulla Mononen and our Vice President Ambroise Bayol. And so we're very excited to actually deepen our collaboration with the EEA as well. And I know I've gone at length. Maybe I'll just give one more reflection. We're looking now into the next 5-year period. We're coming actually close to the end of our adaptation plan. We see that the landscape is changing and has significantly changed since we came up with this plan 4 years ago, or 3.5 years ago. Developments such as the UCRA, the EU taxonomy, giving us a joint language on adaptation and resilience, having the efforts of the Commission around the resilience dialogue, the climate resilience resilience group. Sorry, I forget the name now. Reflection group on climate resilience financing, the EU disclosure requirements, etc. They're really making a real difference. Where we see we need to do more, a collectively, and hopefully the scenario where the EIB can also make a difference and a positive contribution, is really widening the scope of actors that are examining the physical climate risks that they're faced to. They're planning for them, they're investing in them, and just making sure that we're really touching across the public actors, whether they're local authorities, the regulated industries, the big corporates, and even the small actors like SMEs, making sure that all of these actors are taking this challenge seriously. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Elina. But now that we have you there on the screen, I do have one other question for you, which would be on this Provide climate risk dashboard tool that was presented by Carl. You mentioned the knowledge gap and needing to bridge that, and there's often discussion about different levels of data that we need and the levels at which we need it. What do you find interesting in this tool that the Provide research project has developed?
Thank you. I'm actually quite new to the Provide dashboard, so I look forward to playing around with it more. I'm sure we can make use of it also at the EIB. I think what really appealed to me was this functionality around being able to explore the impact of various climate futures, various emission pathways on various climate indicators, I think in what seems quite an accessible way, actually, at local, national, global levels. As was highlighted, right, in the earlier comments, the future is not certain. So being able to integrate this consideration of a wide range of possibilities in how these various climate variables will develop is really key to planning. It's really key to investment. And I think it relates to the broader challenge that we have in this quick evolution that we're having in climate data. It's getting better, it's getting higher resolution, the speed of delivery is quicker than ever, and yet we still struggle actually making that information available in a way that can inform decision making. And we see that in our own operations. We see that actually going from a climate indicator to the actual impacts and answering the questions that our sector experts, whether they're looking at wind power or agriculture, it's not straightforward. And so having these tools that are really taking into consideration the needs of the end user is extremely helpful. I think we need more effort in this space, but wonderful to see this coming through. And maybe just to relate this back again to the EIB context, we're big consumers of climate data. As I mentioned, we've had a climate risk assessment approach in place since 2019. So screening all of our direct lending and increasingly actually also our intermediate lending for physical climate risk, making sure that whatever we do, whatever the objective of our project, it is resilient and fit for purpose in the context of a changing climate. And so this has been truly transformational, actually, in our own understanding of what are the risks, what are the physical climate risks that our projects face and they're exposed to, and also very instrumental in getting our teams and actually our promoters having a way to have a conversation with our clients as well around addressing these risks, coming up with measures, and being able to offer things like the ADAPT platform, dedicated advisory services, is really important. And now we're moving towards we've been using third-party services. We're moving towards a bespoke tool created for the EIB in collaboration with our colleagues from the Copernicus Climate Change Service. And so we're really in the process of having those detailed conversations. What are the questions we need to have answered for the various sectors, for the various projects, and how can we do that in practice? And I think the Provide dashboard kind of offers ways to look at these issues at a more systemic level. We need both. We need that operations project level understanding, but we also need to be thinking about the bigger transitions and the bigger systems at play. And I think having this tool is really positive for that.
Thank you very much, Elina. And I'm really happy to hear how fast indeed EIB has been stepping up and how you see your role in needing to educate, different players in this field so that they know what to apply from you for what. Then I'd like to bring in Kirsi Mäkinen, Senior Ministerial Advisor from the Ministry of Agriculture and Forestry here in Finland. Now, Finland is said to be a front-runner in climate adaptation, and indeed we were the first European country to have a national adaptation strategy already back in 2005. So when the EU climate risk assessment says Europe is not prepared for what's ahead, does that apply to Finland? Are we prepared for what's ahead?
Thank you, Kaisa. Indeed, a very good question, and well, the typical answer always is it depends. But to elaborate a little bit on that, of course, my perspective from the national adaptation policy coordination is always the overview of almost everything that's going on in this field, and the impacts of climate change span across sectors, across levels of governance, and through the interface of public and private. So we really need to, I think, go in more detail into what risks we're looking at, which actors we're talking about, which sectors, and then start finding the answers to this question. So I think we need to move beyond this too generic level of talking about these risks and how are we managing and addressing them, because we're not finding the solutions at the moment that we need to improve resilience, improve risk management. So it depends, but most likely not.
Thank you, Kirsi. It's actually for somebody who's not in the practice of doing all that risk assessment, for example, here in Finland, it looks like we have a lot of plans and a lot of people are doing a lot of things, which is great. I mean, the community is clearly growing from where it was, for example, like 3 years ago, from my perspective. So that alone is great. And then we need to make sure that we're not just spinning the wheels and saying the same things, but actually then learning faster, right? What are your thoughts on the Climate Provide dashboard? What do you find interesting in there for your work?
I had some time to look into the tool ahead of this event, and like Elina, I think there's much more in there to be explored. However, a few first sort of preliminary observations on that is that first of all, I found this idea of connecting the different climate features and reversing the impact chain approach very interesting. So we know from the European level, the communication from the Commission in the spring, that they're recommending that in the future there would be a certain, in a way, minimum level of scenario. Thank you. So we know that from the European level, we should be aiming at a sort of minimum baseline scenario for the future, and then doing testing with even further more extreme scenarios. And these types of tools that give us tangible ways of visualizing and understanding what those target levels and the different futures are in connection with various risks can be very helpful in enabling us to sort of, grapple the complexity of these risks. And I'll be very keen to hear from Susanna, for example, how it looks from the perspective of the local level, as this data indeed looks to be going all the way to the 100 times 100 meters grid. So looking at the tool from the national perspective and finding the map of Finland and some indicators that were there, I did have a question of how I might be able to use this data, because it seemed to be dividing Finland into, say, 8 rather uniform rectangular boxes. So from the perspective of managing fire risk, for example, perhaps Hilppa has a view on how that links with the type of data we've been using at the national level for assessing those risks and managing them. So there's certainly a lot of scope to look more into detail with the tool and find the benefits for the national, regional, and local level users. But that said, what often is the limitation of tools is, of course, the level of data integrity that's needed to produce the tools and maintain them is rather high, and therefore they often end up being rather specialized and providing rather narrow views from the perspective of needing the overview at the national level, for example. So I'm always then asking also the so what question. So how far do these tools take us, and what is the context within which we're using them, and what is the context around the indicators, the narrative around the numbers, so that we can make, operationalize the data and the tools as best as we can.
Thank you, Kirsi. Next, I have Hilpa Gregor, research professor at the Finnish Meteorological Institute, FMI. You are also involved in developing risk assessment tools for policymakers and others. You are, for example, coordinating an EU-funded project called PISA, which stands for Piloting Innovation Insurance Solutions for Adaptation. I would like to hear your thoughts on the tools they have developed, also perhaps in the context of, what kind of risk assessment tools are insurers asking for? Is this close to what you will also be doing? And we've discussed, making tools for the actual users.
Yes.
What are the insurers asking for?
Okay, I thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me here. It's been actually a pleasure to hear about the Provide dashboard and the earlier presentations about the importance and the swifter, smarter, and the more systemic adaptation for Europe and globally. Regarding the dashboard and our future dashboard in PISA, which we are developing also, I was thinking about already the combination or combining these efforts. I think dashboards need to know what is the target audience, as was also discussed. And there was nice case example from border from Norway, and also showing that we need to go to the very local scale, like with the floods. So we need satellite-based monitoring, we need GIS, we need really local data. But that's for today's climate, for today, the realistic, the world today. Then we need these overshooting scenario discussions. So what it means that when we are actually behind the schedule in mitigation. And I think the Provide dashboard is an excellent example of that there are so many views and so many things. If you are from the marine sector or from the biodiversity land use sector, you can have a look what it really means for you when you're deciding or trying to explore your own future and what you would need to do in your work. And then, of course, I was very much interested in the Berlin case. For instance, I was going through what's happening in the cities, how this data is actually used, what's happening with the heat waves. And I was thinking then, for your question, the insurance industry, that we need to know these return periods of some very critical events. How often would they occur in the future? And then is the question of financing. Because if something is happening more often in the future, we need to play with the money invested and the insurance products available, and then also the people willing to buy the insurance. So it's really a dialogue that we need more with these dashboards. And the Provide dashboard is really valuable, and we aim to do these return level experiments or provide services when a person or a citizen or an insurance provider could look at the risk levels, what they will be, how often something will occur, and how you can actually finance it. And then we also need to have the dialogue with citizens, that they understand that they also need to be part of the investments.
Thank you, Hilppa. On this, I want to bring in something that I find mind-blowing when we think about, how detailed data we need and how to use it. You probably have heard this already, but so in the US, some 45% of Americans don't view climate change as a major threat when asked about it in polls. But then at the same time, they do care more about those risks when it's about physical risk for their own homes. So according to Zillow, which is the #1 residential real estate application in the US, over 80% of buyers consider some aspects of climate risks when purchasing a home. And now this company, Zillow, just last month announced that they are introducing climate risks data for sale property listings across the US. So home shoppers will gain insights into 5 key risks: flood, wildfire, wind, heat, and air quality, directly from, these pages, complete with risk scores, interactive maps, and insurance requirements. So basically, in Finland, we would go to Oikotie and we would look for different apartments. So then in addition to how it looks like and it's beautiful and you would get to see, okay, what are the climate risks involved with this, house? I find that mind-blowing. Let's hope that it works. They will use the data from First Street and they should be making it available by the end of the year. So let's look for that. Maybe the city of Helsinki then wants to pilot something like that as well. So we go to Susanna Kankaanpää, who is the project leader in the city of Helsinki. You have worked on climate resilience for the past 15 years, dealing with strategic adaptation planning and monitoring at regional and local level. You've also participated in several EU projects. Where do you see the biggest needs for stepping up when it comes to cities' preparedness for climate risks?
Thank you. For cities, I can only talk about ours from the perspective of ours, because cities are very diverse, of course, and so their critical adaptation needs are different. But from my point of view, the time frames are the ones that we really need to step up. I feel that there is a lack of urgency concerning adaptation. There is urgency, the feel of urgency concerning mitigation, which is of course important because mitigation is very important to also from the point of view of adaptation. But then we don't really feel that it is still yet for us to critically start working seriously with adaptation. We can handle the extreme events that are happening now. For example, heat waves. We have preparedness for those. It is an excess burden for the social and health services and emergency services, for example, but they can handle it so far. But how far is that still happening? And what we, I think, lack more is the long-term adaptation. Are we really building our cities so that they are still safe and livable in the future climate? And do we really realize that the climate has changed and it will continue changing? I feel that most of the urban planning practices are still for the current or maybe even the past climate, not to the climate that we are living in, and our children and grandchildren as well. And adaptation, of course, is a very local thing, and it's something that there are no freeloaders. You can still, if you're not a very pleasant person, be a freeloader in mitigation, but in adaptation it's unavoidable and it's a must. For example, if Singapore is well adapted to heat, as I hear, it doesn't help us in Helsinki at all. So anyway, but that gets to me to my. I was reading this morning in an article. It didn't concern adaptation, which is surprising for me because I mostly live with, reading about adaptation all the time. But anyway, this is relevant to adaptation as well, because in an article they said about this subject that it is possible to read quite a lot about it before you bump into anything concrete. And getting to that, the next point, what we need to step up is setting targets for adaptation. It's difficult, it's more difficult than for mitigation, but we would still need to do that. We would need to make clear our priorities. For example, we can't prioritize continuous growth of the city and having it adaptive at the same time. Well, you can maybe do it, but it's difficult. So you have to set up priorities. And well, do we really have them? Well, that's a question. And then leadership for adaptation. It's a new thing. Adaptation is a new issue. Like Kaisa said, the past 2 years have been really great for adaptation because the talk has increased a lot. But still, the processes and the leadership, the concrete leadership is well, it still needs to be defined. And we need to set also the level of preparedness or the level of adaptation. That is difficult as well, but as we can't adapt to everything, we have to make a political decision to what level adaptation we need to do here in Helsinki and in other cities as well. And then slowly and surely we have to get to the effective concrete actions. And the third thing, because I've been, for the past a year, months, whatever, I've been trying to think about how to adapt this city to the heat waves that we are having already and that are coming. And I've been thinking, are we taking heat seriously enough here up north? Because we're used to all kinds of extreme heat weather events here, but we always been a cold. This has been a cool or cold climate, and heat is something, it's just only nice. But like we've heard in Europe and also in Helsinki, it's not nice anymore. We've had heat waves that had caused, negative impacts to some of our populations. But because we are a cold climate and cool climate, we have built our new houses very energy efficient, which means they are airtight, which means that they are hot in the summer, and so on. So we have all kinds of these kind of processes here. But anyway, those were my 3 steps, very presidential.
Thank you, Susanna. For me, that was mind-blowing too. I mean, after all this discussion, for 20 years, including in Finland, you say that cities are still being built like for today or even for the past. That is mind-blowing. So eventually, you talk about we need to get concrete. Eventually, it has to mean things like, because we're talking about systemic, we're talking about health, we're also talking about mental health. So when we talk about like city of Helsinki, I come to think of an example where a friend of mine was becoming a mother, getting a child, and at that point, people often think about the future and where are we going and so forth. So when she was, going to the having an appointment in the maternity clinic or the child health center, neuvola we say, she was kind of hoping that there would be a space to kind of discuss these issues too, and not just your like traditional health, but like how are we coping? So eventually I'm hoping that the adaptation or resilience strategies in cities include things like, when you are meeting your citizens in different places, was it school or neuvola or other places, that there would be this comprehensive understanding of, yes, we are in this together and we are dealing with this, and this is how we in this sector are working on this. Which brings me to the last question, which we need to take very fast because we kind of we're approaching the end of our session. There was a question on amok, and I think the sea currents that keep, for example, Finland habitable in the current atmosphere that we're used to. And there's been a lot of talk about tipping points recently because, I mean, nobody can quite explain what's happening right now as the temperatures have been so extreme over the past 2 years, and we're seeing some very worrying signs. And as Ismo said in his presentation a couple of weeks ago, we got the State of the Climate report, which warned that we are entering an unpredictable new phase in the climate crisis. Building on what Susanna also said in terms of are we just adapting to things we already know and that are close? And to what extent are we trying to understand these tipping points and what they require? Are we incorporating considerations of tipping points into our resilience planning, and to what extent that is happening? Short comments from panelists.
May I start? Yeah. Okay, in our flagship ACCC, Atmospheric Climate Competence Center, we are looking at these tipping points, and we, for instance, modeled the impact of amok shutdown on Finland and Europe. So for those scenarios, we saw that the winters will become 20 degrees colder and summers 5 degrees colder. But we don't know when or if that will happen. But these are not at all in the scenarios or these adaptation plans and strategies that we are making. But I'm currently telling this in all of my presentations that I'm giving, that we need to have also these scenarios included in our adaptation strategies. And for instance, a week ago, I was participating in this energy sector event where they were asking for these future climate risks and weather risks. So I just had to tell them that this is one of the things you need to consider when you plan the energy system.
Thank you, Hilpa. Kirsi, you want to say something?
Yes, I think we need to do that much more. And when we were preparing the current national adaptation plan that looks to 2030, there was still this kind of complacency that, all the scenarios are looking at, or, roughly the same by 2030. And we weren't talking that much about tipping points, high-end scenarios, etc. So in the coming years, as we look to gearing up towards the midterm review of the current NAP, as we prepare for the national risk assessment on weather and climate-related risks to then feed into the next policy cycle, we need to bring in much more of this information on the not the incremental and not the next 5 to 10 years, but bring in much more the longer time horizon, as Susanna was also pointing out, and looking forward to having that process where we do need to step up also the dialogue between the policymakers, the practitioners, and the science.
Thank you, Kirsi. Susanna?
Short answer, no.
That was short. Short but worrying. Elina, maybe you have some, encouraging news how you are incorporating tipping points?
I would say in a kind of a concrete manner, no. I think perhaps there's a point around also the level of analysis and where this makes best sense. I think it's also difficult if you think about the types of operators that we work with, whether it's distribution, electric distribution, transmission operators, water utilities, local authorities. It might be actually a very difficult challenge to put on these kinds of actors. So I think probably tipping points need to be much more prevalent in our planning, in our risk analysis. But I think it probably needs to start at a higher level order. But I was really struck by the comment that, and I think this relates to the tipping point conversation as well, the point that Susanna made about, are we building cities that are safe and livable in a future climate? I think getting to those systemic level questions across systems that the UCRA highlights, etc., is a real challenge for organization like ours, the EIB, for instance, that is project based, is a project taker. We take the projects that come to us, and so being able to work together, I think across actors, whether it's in the EU and the Commission at the national level, I think is really, really important to get to those systemic changes and being able to do this analysis also on tipping points that is operational also for the other actors downstream. But I see a hand up from Carl. Like he's spent a lot of time thinking about this, so let's hear from him as well.
Let's give Carl. We're running a bit out of time, but I'm giving you. We are taking just 5 minutes extra. I hope that's okay, Carl.
Okay, thank you. I try to be very brief. I mean, a few things to say from the project, because we obviously looked into this question also in the context of overshoot, and I think there's two main insights that I want to share. The first one is a bit of a critical one in terms of how we frame overshoot and near-term climate risks, tipping points and near-term climate risks, because I think we tend to think more or discuss these things more while they're not necessarily our key risk drivers in the very, very near term. So even if an AMOC collapse were come to pass, this could take decades to centuries to materialize. That is very serious, and it's a very serious risk for future generations. But it's maybe not necessarily the most biggest risk we need to look at right here, right now. And if I pick up on Susanna's comment on the climate risks that we are not really looking at, we have something like at 1.3 degrees of warming and a warming rate of a quarter of a degree per decade right now. This means we heat the planet up by half a degree in 20 years. So if you think about the climate extremes that we are experiencing, a 1 in 20 year extreme, purely statistically, the last time it has happened, the planet was half a degree cooler. So we have a massive climate experience gap right now. We don't even know how bad climate risks are today. And every year we are seeing records being broken by a big margin. And if you didn't have, a record-breaking event in your city or in your district or wherever you look at for your adaptation action, be worried. Because the next time the record's going to be broken, it's probably not going to be just an incremental change. There's a risk that it's going to be a big step change, and the climate risk that you are currently thinking you're having may be dwarfed by what is going to materialize. That would make a bit of a case for saying, let's look at high-end climate risks a bit more systematically. They don't need to be tipping points. They can just be, the high end of your risk distribution that you're currently having, and acknowledging that we have this climate experience gap right now that may actually lead us to continue to do incremental adaptation action that Susanna has pointed to, maybe even planting the same tree species we have had in our cities, not really appreciating that they are not suitable for a future climate that we're going to expect in 20 years' time. And then when it comes to tipping points, I think a pathway perspective and a bit of an holistic view on this is very important. We need to appreciate that this is really, there's deep uncertainties around this, and this is a scientific frontier. We did several big publications out of the project on that very question that show, for example, that the Atlantic overturning circulation, a lot of also surprising dynamics in the future, not necessarily a complete shutdown, but maybe also something like an AMOC recovery under overshoot, where you then, for example, have a scenario where global temperatures are in decline and European temperatures continue to rise for centuries because the AMOC is actually recovering as the planet cools. So there's a lot more in there in terms of the reflection. And yes, there is a need for incorporating those in high stress testing scenarios, but I think it's more a question of timescales and targeted reflections, where I think the question of tipping points and planetary stewardship is much more coming into the question of where should we set our mitigation ambition. And I don't think it should actually be really necessarily be the target point for high risk climate risk assessments that try to inform adaptation action, at least not at this point in time. Thank you.
Thank you, Carl. Well, that's very interesting, but yeah, obviously mitigation and adaptation are inherently interlinked. So in the overall risk assessment, we anyway need to take it into more consideration. So thank you, panel, for the excellent discussion. Thank you, presenters. We still have a 3-minute slot for Maria Parry, who will basically bring us together with some conclusions from this discussion and towards next steps. I'm just saying that from the questions, one of the questions that was sent from the audience was that how can we improve the take-up of EU climate risk assessment results even further? And I think Leena already said that many countries are already like using the same methodology for themselves. So that is giving us common language, and that I guess will help setting targets as well, as Susanna said. So maybe this is also interesting. But Maria, you had 3 minutes. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much for inviting me here and giving me the opportunity to reflect on these distinguished speakers that I have the honor to work with as well. My voice is a bit hoarse and as I'm recovering from a flu, but hopefully you can hear me. Are we stepping up to understand and reduce climate risks? I guess it to some extent depends on what we mean by stepping up and what is considered as stepping up. As we have heard, a lot is happening on this field at the moment. There is cutting-edge research on climate change as a meteorological phenomenon, and also as a threat to our socio-economic systems. And this information is being translated into guidelines and tools such as the climate risk dashboard. And adaptation to climate risks is also one of the key aspects of the Paris Agreement, giving us the imperative to strengthen resilience and reduce vulnerability. The European Union is allocating significant resources to support adaptation, for instance, at the subnational and local level through the mission adaptation. And as we have heard, financing is available to implement adaptive investments. And here in Finland, we have the National Adaptation Plan, and indeed adaptation is increasingly recognized as something that should be integrated into, let's say, urban planning or water management, etc. And currently several Finnish regions are assessing climate risks that are relevant to their respective areas and writing adaptation action plans. However, the step from words turning into action is still waiting to be taken if we zoom in and look at different sectors of society or geographical areas. If I'm asked to show an example of adaptation measure, something tangible, or maybe a novel way of doing something in a different way to build resilience, that it's a bit challenging to show. So basically, I could conclude before I run out of voice that it's essential to continue to gain our understanding on climate risks and plan for the future. But it is also time to support the actual implementation of adaptation measures. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maria. Thank you, panelists, presenters. Thank you, audience. I guess one last word in the end is Ismo mentioned this report by former President Niinistö, and I think he said that it's coming next week on the overall preparedness, comprehensive preparedness, covering civil and military topics, but also issues of climate risks and what is needed to build community resilience in Europe. So let's look forward for that as well. Thank you so much for coming. If there were questions that were not answered, I will reach out to the presenters. So while we send you the presentations, you will get perhaps those answers as well. Thank you very much and have a nice weekend.